Welcome to the deep dive. We often talk about burnout and stress in the modern age, but today we're stepping back 3 centuries to look at a life defined by, well, physical privation and an almost unbearable spiritual intensity.
We're exploring a year in the life of David Brainerd, a journey into the raw, unforgiving wilderness, both, outside his window and deep within his own soul.
And this deep dive draws heavily on the core source material. That is, the summary of the life of Reverend David Brainerd, chiefly extracted from his diary by President Edwards. We're focusing on Chapter 5. We should also mention this summary is created with the help of AI, but it is instructed to stay incredibly close to the chapter.
And Chapter 5 is just a critical piece of 18th century American history and theology. It covers Brainerd's life from April 1st, 1743, all the way to June 12th, 1744.
A little over a year.
Exactly. And in that year, you get his isolated labor among the Indians at Kaunaumeek, his deep personal suffering, that very controversial relationship with Yale College, and then his move to the Forks of the Delaware and his ordination.
And we're really taking the words directly from his diary, and of course, the meticulous notes from his editor, Jonathan Edwards.
That's the only way to do it, to really understand a life lived under such radical self-scrutiny.
So our mission here is to take you beyond just a summary and to really experience the landscape of David Brainerd. We're going to try to understand the trials, the bursts of profound spiritual joy, and the unwavering dedication that defined his life.
And maybe understand why, for him, the pursuit of holiness was so much more difficult than just surviving the physical wilderness.
Okay, let's unpack this. We start immediately with the physical conditions. Brainerd accepts the mission to the Kaunaumeek Indians. He records arriving on April 1st, 1743.
April Fool's Day, of all days.
Right. He rode to the location, which was, and I'm quoting here, in the wilderness near 20 miles from Stockbridge. And about the same from Albany. I mean, he is truly out there.
Completely isolated. That's not a casual distance in 1743. That's a full day's journey, if you're lucky.
And his lodging. It is immediately jarring. He mentions he lodged with a poor Scotchman about 1.5 miles distant from them on a little heap of straw in a log room without any floor.
Without any floor. That's the detail that always gets me.
I mean, setting aside the 20-mile commute to work every day, this isn't even a cabin. It's a rough log structure, probably open to the elements. This is just radical physical discomfort.
That phrase, a log room without any floor, is so vital. It signals a level of just rough, temporary living that goes way beyond simple poverty. A packed dirt floor or no floor at all meant constant dampness, constant exposure.
Vermin, cold, everything.
Everything. And for a man who was already, as Edwards notes later, constitutionally frail, this was a recipe for chronic illness. But you have to remember, in his mind, these physical hardships, they were the easy part of the trial.
And we know that because on that very first day, the physical discomfort was completely eclipsed by his spiritual distress. He writes, "I was greatly exercised with inward trials and seemed to have no God to go to. Oh, that God would help me."
Right there. The man is sleeping on straw in a dirt-floored hovel, 20 miles from civilization, and his chief complaint is the absence of God's manifest presence.
It's just a different mindset.
It's the New England evangelical spirit operating at full throttle. For Brainerd, the real wilderness wasn't the trees and the isolation. It was the state of his own heart. The greatest torment was the sense of spiritual abandonment.
So if he felt God was near, he could endure anything.
Anything. But the moment God seemed distant, the temporal difficulties became unbearable. It really frames the entire narrative of this chapter.
And that sense of profound self-abhorrence, it just accelerates. By April 7th, just a week later, he's expressing this desperate longing for release, for death.
Yeah, the entry is stark.
He records, "Appeared to myself exceedingly ignorant, weak, surplus, unworthy, and altogether unequal to my work. It seemed to me that I should never do any service or have any success among the Indians. My soul was weary of my life. I longed for death beyond measure."
Beyond measure. It's a shocking statement.
It is, but he immediately checks himself, which is where you see the internal mechanics of his faith become so clear. He recognizes that this ardent desire for death was, and this is him again, partly from the want of resignation to God under all miseries, and so were but impatience.
And that's the perfect example of how the period's rigorous self-examination worked. Most of us, feeling that despair, we'd seek comfort, right? Brainerd immediately applies a theological scalpel. Why do I want death? If the desire is just for relief from suffering, it's inherently selfish. It's impatience.
So even wanting to feel better is a sin.
In his view, if it's not aligned with God's will, yes. True holiness required perfect resignation to God's will, even if that will meant decades of spiritual darkness and physical pain. He's judging the very desire for relief as a sin of impatience.
It's a relentless self-policing mechanism. Yet amid this internal torture, he gets a glimmer of hope, which reinforces the mission.
It comes on April 10th.
Yeah, he spent time in the woods praying, and then preached to the Indians. And he notices 2 or 3 appearing under religious concern, and one told him that her heart had cried ever since she first heard me preach.
That one line, her heart had cried, must have been such a powerful validation for him.
It had to be.
In this era, conversion wasn't just, intellectual assent. It was a profound, emotional, often painful turning of the soul. So for Brainerd, who felt utterly useless and unequal to the task, this small seed of success, it was the lifeline he needed.
It was proof that the mission was God's, not his own.
Precisely.
But his spiritual state was so dependent on his immediate environment. When he was exposed to profane talk from some ungodly men who came to hear him preach on April 16th, the darkness it comes rushing back. The next day, April 17th, his revulsion is profound. He writes, "Oh, I thought what a hell it would be to live with such men to eternity." He groans out his complaint, and yet finds this small moment of gratitude that God had made him to differ from these men. It's an incredibly intense reaction to just some ungodly conversation.
Well, it reveals the chasm that existed between the deeply converted and those who were just, participating in external religion during the Great Awakening. Brainerd saw the ungodly not just as unpleasant companions, but as representatives of the final unredeemed state.
So his isolation was a kind of spiritual protection.
Yes. And when that contamination intruded, it felt like a terrifying preview of eternal separation from God.
This pattern of extreme trial followed by sudden, intense, but temporary relief is the rhythm of this entire year. April 19th. My soul seemed lifted above the deep waters, wherein it has long been almost drowned. He just gets this quick burst of faith before plunging back down.
And then comes his birthday, April 20th.
His 25th birthday. This is not a day for cake, clearly. He immediately set the day apart for fasting and prayer, specifically for the bestowment of divine grace, and that all my spiritual afflictions and inward distresses might be sanctified to my soul.
The sanctification of distress, that's a crucial idea here. He didn't pray for the distress to be removed.
No, he prayed for it to be used.
Exactly, that the distress itself, the anxiety, the loneliness, the self-loathing, would be used by God to purify him. For Brainerd, suffering was a discipline. It was a tool for achieving the holiness he craved.
Now, we get to May 10th, which I think this has the single most defining passage of this early period. It reveals the radical nature of his self-judgment. He reflects on his past actions, even those he performed with a clear conscience, and writes, "Almost all the actions of my life past seem to be covered over with sin and guilt. Oh, the pride, selfishness, hypocrisy, ignorance, bitterness, party zeal, and the want of love that have attended my attempts to promote the interests of religion."
And he adds that this was the case even when he felt he had real assistance from God. "But alas," he says, "what corrupt mixtures attended my best duties."
Corrupt mixtures. So even his best efforts, the times he felt closest to God, were contaminated by pride.
This is a perfect distillation of the doctrine of indwelling sin and total depravity. Now, we as modern listeners, we might hear that and think, wow, he sounds pathologically depressed.
Right.
But theologically, he's just applying the doctrine of original sin to its logical, painful conclusion. If the human heart is totally corrupt, then even an action that seems pure on the surface, like preaching a powerful sermon, is secretly motivated by a desire for praise or self-recognition.
He's judging his motives not against the standards of men,
but against the absolute infinite standard of God's holiness. By that measure, every action, every thought is fundamentally flawed, and this terrible realization is paradoxically what compels him forward. If he can't rely on his own goodness, he has to rely entirely on God's grace.
The recognition of universal failure becomes the fuel for faith.
It's a brutal kind of self-surgery.
And while this spiritual crisis is unfolding, the temporal reality is just grinding him down. On May 18th, he summarizes his situation. Extreme isolation. "I live in the most lonesome wilderness, have but one single person to converse with that can speak English."
Poverty.
Extreme poverty.
Yeah.
"Most of my diet consists of boiled corn, hasty pudding, etc. I lodge on a bundle of straw." And then there's the active opposition from the Dutch, who threatened to drive the Indians off the land because they hate him for preaching.
And to address his sole companion, Jonathan Edwards provides a crucial note here. That one English-speaking person was John Owawampaquinit, Brainerd's young Indian interpreter from Stockbridge.
Oh, interesting.
Edwards makes a point of noting that this young man was instructed by other ministers, he was fully bilingual, and quite skilled. This detail is important because it shows Brainerd wasn't entirely alone, but the interpreter was more than just a linguistic tool. He was a vital, though limited, spiritual and cultural anchor.
And despite this barrage of spiritual agony and temporal hardship, that anchor holds. On May 20th, he finds strength in a verse from Isaiah. His soul rises so far above his troubles that he dared to rejoice in God. It's just a remarkable fluctuation.
It really is.
So, his intense isolation is soon broken by necessary travel. In late May and early June 1743, Brainerd has to leave Kaunaumeek. First, he goes to New Jersey to consult with the commissioners, and then he proceeds to New Haven.
Back to the place that expelled him, back to Yale College, hoping for reconciliation.
And this trip brings us right into the heart of the Great Awakening controversy.
Yeah.
We should probably pause here to give some context to that expulsion.
We definitely should. Brainerd was expelled in 1742 because he was what they called a New Light enthusiast. He embraced the zealous, experiential preaching of figures like George Whitefield and Gilbert Tennant.
And the faculty at Yale were
generally Old Light, more traditional, formal, and deeply suspicious of the emotional enthusiasm of the revival.
So essentially, Brainerd was kicked out for having too much spiritual zeal and for saying it too loud.
Precisely. His expulsion wasn't just for, missing classes. It was for publicly questioning the spiritual state of his superiors. When a major revival is sweeping the colonies and students are questioning whether their professors are truly converted, you have a serious institutional crisis on your hands.
They saw it as undermining the entire structure.
Not just as impudence, but as a threat to the established church and the college itself.
And the travel to New Haven itself was a challenge. He was lost in the woods, returning to Kaunaumeek, lay all night in the open air. Yet when he got back on June 12th, he had greater assistance in preaching among them than ever before.
Again, hardship precedes spiritual power. That's the pattern.
Skipping forward a few weeks, we find this profound moment of objective comfort on July 25th. He's struggling with his own lack of holiness, and he finds relief in a comfortable meditation on God's eternity that he never had a beginning.
And what's fascinating is how he describes the feeling.
Yeah, he says, "Whence I was led to admire his greatness and power in such a manner that I stood still and praised the Lord for his own glories and perfections. Though I was, and if I should forever be, an unholy creature, my soul was comforted to apprehend an eternal, infinite, powerful, holy God."
It's a classic example of evangelical transcendence. His comfort isn't based on his feeling holy, which he knew he wasn't, but on the unchangeable fact of God's existence.
So his own misery becomes small in comparison.
Exactly. If God is eternal and infinite, then Brainerd's personal misery is just a temporary shadow in the light of ultimate reality. His spiritual self-worth is zero, but God's intrinsic worth is infinite, and that's where his soul rests.
The ultimate test of this resignation came on September 14th, when he arrived at New Haven during commencement week, the exact day he should have received his degree.
That had to be a public humiliation, confronting what he had lost in the eyes of the world.
You would think so, but he writes that despite his fears, God enabled him to say with calmness and resignation, "The will of the Lord be done." He even notes he felt much more pleasure and divine comfort than I expected.
And that's a radical, practical demonstration of his priorities, isn't it? Academic prestige, worldly honor. They were clearly subservient to what he saw as the will of God. His contentment in that moment was a victory over the temptation of earthly validation.
The next day, September 15th, was dedicated to the formal submission of his confession to the rector and trustees. He offered it to cut off all occasion of offense.
He was willing to swallow his pride for the sake of reconciliation and, crucially, to maintain the support network for his mission.
Let's look at the details of that confession. He starts with what he calls the Whittlesey incident.
Right.
He confessed he sinned against God and injured a Mr. Whittlesey, who was a tutor, by saying he did not believe the tutor had any more grace than the chair I then leaned upon.
Wow. He admits it was aggravated because Whittlesey was his superior.
Then there's the rector incident. He addresses the accusation of saying he wondered he did not expect to drop down dead for fining the scholars that followed Mr. Tennant to Milford.
And his response to that is so interesting.
He says he doesn't remember saying it, but immediately adds that if he did, he would utterly condemn it and detest all such kind of behavior.
Notice the extreme humility there. He's essentially saying, I don't recall this specific insult, but given the darkness of my own heart, I'm sure I could have said something equally terrible, and I condemn the behavior entirely.
He doesn't quibble over the facts.
No, he focuses on the motive. He also humbly asks forgiveness for attending a separate, unauthorized religious meeting in New Haven.
And his stated motivation for this extraordinary public self-abasement is even more striking. He says he would do anything consistently with truth for the sake of peace. He even says he would confess on his knees, even if they used his confession to blacken my character the more.
And Edwards was there. He was a witness. He attests to Brainerd's very Christian spirit, characterized by calmness and humility, without the least appearance of rising of spirit for any ill treatment. That's high praise coming from Edwards.
So were they satisfied?
Edwards says the governors were satisfied with the confession. They were willing to admit him back, but they imposed a condition. He had to remain there for 12 months to receive his degree.
Which he couldn't do.
No. The mission correspondents demanded he stay at his post, so he had to refuse. And Edwards stresses that Brainerd manifested no disappointment or resentment. He chose the wilderness, the straw bed, and the mission over the promise of worldly ease.
That was the moment then. The path of his life became irrevocably set.
I think so.
Following his return from that Yale confrontation, Brainerd shifts his focus back to Kaunaumeek, and he finally secures a place of refuge for himself.
From August 1743, he moves out of the Scotchman's log room and into his own small hut, which he records was built chiefly with his own hands by long and hard labor.
In the moment he moves in, there's this immediate spiritual release. On July 30th and 31st, he notes finding comfort in solitude. Blessed be the Lord, who has now given me a place of retirement. Oh, that I may find God in it, and that he would dwell with me forever.
The physical act of building his own small structure, however rudimentary, was just. It was essential to his spiritual life. It provided a boundary, a sanctuary from the occasional profane intrusion, and a place to maintain his rigorous devotional schedule.
We might see a cabin as lonely, but for him it was freedom.
Freedom to pursue uninterrupted communion with God.
And he immediately codifies this freedom into a discipline. On August 3rd and 4th, he shares a core principle of his spiritual life. He notes that the more he prays, the more he delights to do so.
And the reverse is true when he's deprived of it.
This leads to the key insight of his discipline, something that, resonates even today in discussions of productivity and routine. He says, a seasonable, steady performance of secret duties in their proper hours and a careful improvement of all time are excellent means of spiritual peace.
That's 18th century time management advice par excellence. It's not enough to be busy. Time must be improved. It's a purposeful, almost militant approach to sanctification. Every hour must be filled with profitable labor.
Spiritual labor of the heart, intellectual labor of the head, or physical labor of the hands.
Right. This constant active effort prevents the intrusion of sinful thoughts or idleness, which he viewed as, devil's workshop.
And occasionally, this intense labor yields an incredible spiritual reward. On August 13th, he records a season of spiritual rapture. His soul was full of tenderness and love, even to the most inveterate of my enemies.
He describes the feeling so beautifully. All my past sorrows seemed kindly to disappear, and I remembered no more the sorrow for joy.
His love extends universally, wishing that others could know the goodness of God and finding this profound peace in God's absolute sovereignty over everything.
These rapture seasons are the emotional and spiritual payoff for his relentless struggle. They were the tangible, though temporary, proof of his election and the reality of divine grace. And they confirmed that all the physical pain and self-denial were worth it.
Which explains why he could endure the next trial so easily.
Which arrives just 2 days later.
August 15th. The constant temporal suffering returns. He's enduring physical weakness and distress because he has no suitable food, no bread, only cakes made from Indian meal. He says he had to send 10 or 15 miles for bread and often went days without it.
And yet, listen to his response.
It's incredible. Yet I felt contented with my circumstances and sweetly resigned to God. In prayer, I enjoyed great freedom and blessed God as much from my present circumstances as if I had been a king. Blessed be God.
It's the ultimate counterintuitive statement. He's physically starving, yet spiritually satisfied beyond measure. The inner contentment, rooted in his resignation to God's providence, completely neutralizes the external deprivation.
This is what self-denial is really about for him.
It's the highest form, to prove that human happiness is entirely independent of creature comforts.
We also have to remember the context of his constant travel. Edwards notes that Brainerd was frequently riding 20 miles between Stockbridge and Kaunaumeek just to learn the Indian language from a Mr. Sargent.
Yes, that's Edwards' notey. This forced travel explains why Brainerd was perpetually disordered in body. The commissioner's demand for language instruction, though necessary for the mission, conflicted directly with Brainerd's need for the isolation and routine that sustained his spiritual health.
He was balancing institutional demands against physical survival.
And spiritual necessity. It was a constant tension.
Amidst all this, his reflection on the passage of time is profound. January 1st, 1744 arrives, and he reflects on the past year. And then he reveals this truly astonishing detail.
The 100 pounds.
Yeah. He says, I have been enabled in about 15 months past to bestow to charitable uses about 100 pounds New England money. 100 pounds. This is a vast sum for a man who's lodging on straw and eating boiled corn.
It speaks volumes about his view of himself as a steward, not an owner. If we consider the purchasing power of that money, it was an incredibly significant portion of his meager income. His charity was a radical, practical demonstration of his faith.
If he truly trusted God for all things, then retaining wealth was pointless.
He was living out his theology through his finances.
He wraps up this period on January 3rd, confirming his need for continual retirement, lamenting that his time away for literature learning is mostly spent in perplexity and barrenness. He concludes he can't lead a Christian life when I am abroad. He needs that solitude.
It's his spiritual life support.
The new year brings an intensification of his devotional life, a desperate push toward purity. On January 6th, he sets apart a fast day, going for 24 hours without eating or drinking, specifically to wash away the dreadful spots and stains of sin.
This intense focus on mortification, the spiritual practice of putting sin to death, yields clarity for him.
It does. His key resolution is that his resolutions for a life of mortification, continual watchfulness, self-denial, seriousness, and devotion were strong and fixed. Everything earthly appears to him as but an empty bubble, a deluding dream.
And we should probably define mortification for the modern listener. It's not just physical asceticism, though that was part of it for him.
Right.
It was the conscious, systematic, sometimes painful effort to identify, attack, and destroy the remaining sinful impulses in the soul. It was a rigorous, brutal inward surgery performed constantly, fueled by the realization that sin wasn't just an action, but a foundational corruption.
And this relentless pursuit of purity, this focus on the invisible God, it elevates his prayer life. January 14th, he records a period of intense angelic prayer. He was able to see him who is invisible and continue in prayer for nearly an hour.
And his longing is for angelic holiness.
Yes, he writes, longed exceedingly for an angelic holiness and purity, and to have all my thoughts at all times employed in divine and heavenly things. His goal is nothing less than perfect spiritual alignment, not just in action, but in every single thought.
This longing is a direct result of his previous conviction about those corrupt mixtures. He understands that the only true life is one free from sin, entirely dedicated to God. He's reaching for that ideal state, even as his experience teaches him that on earth, it will remain just out of reach.
February 3rd brings one of his most important theological revelations, connecting his painful experience of sin directly to his doctrine of God's sovereignty.
A huge moment for him.
He realizes he is now more sensible than ever that God alone is the author and finisher of our faith, that the whole and every part of sanctification is the effect of his power and grace, that without him I can do nothing in the strictest sense.
And he connects this realization to the absolute depravity of man. And this is where it gets so, well, really interesting and frankly terrifying.
Yeah, he says, oh, how amazing it is that people can talk so much about men's power and goodness, when if God did not hold us back every moment, we should be devils incarnate. This, my bitter experience, has abundantly taught me concerning myself.
That is a staggering statement. Brainerd is saying his own daily struggle with sinful thoughts, pride, bitterness, and patience is living proof that man possesses no inherent goodness. We aren't just flawed, we are fundamentally, catastrophically sinful.
And the only reason we're not all devils incarnate is that God is actively restraining us.
Every single second.
Yeah.
But this realization doesn't lead him to paralyzing fear. It leads him to absolute trust. If he can do nothing and God must do everything, then the pressure is taken off his own flawed efforts. He rests entirely on God's omnipotent grace.
This doctrine of divine sovereignty, so central to Jonathan Edwards' own theology, becomes his existential comfort.
It absolutely does.
And this comfort fuels an even deeper adoration of God as the supreme good. On February 7th, the language of his heart is pure devotion. Whom have I in heaven but thee? And there is none upon earth that I desire beside thee.
And he describes true happiness as simply pleasing God.
Oh, I feel that it is heaven to please him, and to be just what he would have me to be. He identifies his deepest pain, not the hunger or the cold, but having a heart wounded by offending God. He says he could bear any suffering, but cannot bear to grieve and dishonor this blessed God.
And that's the evangelical shift from self-pity to God-centered grief. His focus has moved entirely from his own suffering to God's glory. The greatest tragedy is not his isolation, but that he, a fallen creature, has diminished the honor due to an infinitely holy God.
The ultimate spiritual fruit of this purity is demonstrated on March 3rd, a radical, transcendent love for enemies. He spends an hour in prayer with the most soft and tender affection toward all mankind.
And this affection is absolute.
It really is, he writes. It seemed refreshing to think of meeting them in heaven, how much soever they had injured me on earth, had no disposition to insist upon any confession from them in order to reconciliation.
That phrase, no disposition to insist upon any confession, is revolutionary. Think back to the Yale incident where he was forced to confess on his knees to his superiors.
Right.
Here, Brainerd is saying that in the true spiritual state, he would drop all pretense, all requirements for vindication. Forgiveness is total, flowing from divine love, not from human negotiation.
He describes this desired spiritual state as one where the soul is sedate, mild, and meek, to be void of all evil surmisings and suspicions, and scarce able to think evil of any man upon any occasion.
That's the meekness that can survive the wilderness.
Finally, on March 10th, he records his feeling of deadness to the world and sweet resignation. He writes, I thought I was ready and willing to give up life and all its comforts as soon as called to it, and yet then had as much comfort of life as almost ever I had.
He's simultaneously longing for death while being content with life. That demonstrates a spirit completely liberated from the fear of loss. He longed to be perpetually and entirely crucified to all things here below by the cross of Christ. That is the defining triumph of this grueling year.
So with the Kaunaumeek Indians preparing to move to Stockbridge, Brainerd's time there was concluding. His last public service is recorded on March 11th, where he preached on the parable of the sower.
And as he prepares to leave, he writes a crucial letter to a Reverend Mr. Pemberton, where he lays out his practical methodology. This is where we shift from his intense personal piety to, methodical, practical missionary work.
This letter shows he's a sophisticated educator, not just an enthusiastic preacher. He deliberately chose his focus on plainness, studying what was most plain and easy and best suited to their capacities.
He recognized he couldn't start with abstract theological concepts.
And he distilled his teaching into two core themes. The order is important. He starts with depravity, their sinfulness and misery, their guilt, their inability to save themselves, and their extreme need of Christ.
He had to first convince them they were lost.
Only then did he move to the second theme, the fullness of redemption. He opened the all-sufficiency and freeness of that redemption, wrought by Christ, showing how it was suited to all their wants. That's a classic conversion pathway.
And his instructional methods were actually quite innovative for the time and culture. He didn't just stand up and preach, he built an educational framework. This included composing and translating prayers and psalms into the Indian language.
Teaching them to pray and sing in their own tongue, that's crucial.
It is, for establishing an authentic, internalized form of Christian worship, not just importing English cultural forms.
He also focused heavily on historical context, giving them a full biblical education. Accounts of God's dealings with the Jews, the meaning of rites, sacrifices.
This approach was genius. He understood that these native cultures had a deep reverence for oral history and tradition. By starting with the Old Testament, he gave context to why the sacrifices were necessary, preparing them for the ultimate sacrifice of Christ.
He was systematically expounding the Gospel of St. Matthew almost every evening, ensuring they had daily, consistent instruction. And his success, though small, was real. Despite his earlier despair, he records that the truths of God's word seemed at times to be attended with some power upon the hearts and consciences of the Indians, and several came voluntarily. Some with tears inquired what they should do to be saved.
And that phrase, inquired what they should do to be saved, is the missionary's ultimate validation. It means the seed had taken root. For all his intense struggles with self-doubt, God had demonstrably worked through his mission.
Now we have to confront the final radical act of sacrifice in this period, the decision to move. Brainerd sought a new field among the Delaware Indians.
And it is so vital to underscore the context here. He rejected multiple offers for comfortable, established settlements.
He turned down earnest invitations to places like East Hampton on Long Island and another near his native town. This choice was made after a year of extreme hardship. He chose the most difficult, most uncertain path again.
This highlights the absolute nature of his calling. The path of least resistance was available to him, a settled ministry, better pay, better health. But his commission was to the poor heathens in the remote wilderness.
He viewed his duty as going to those who had the least access to the gospel.
Regardless of the personal cost, he had achieved the ultimate state of self-denial. Physical comfort held no appeal compared to fulfilling his commission.
And the cost was immediate. On April 30th and May 1st, he took leave of Kaunaumeek. He records riding through the wilderness in the rain while so disordered in body that little or nothing but blood came from me.
I
have to stop you there. Riding 20 miles while hemorrhaging, in the rain, yet prioritizing the mission, that borders on self-destruction from a modern perspective. How would Edwards have framed that?
Edwards and that whole pietistic tradition would have seen it not as disregard, but as holy perseverance, a profound trust in God to sustain the body until the work was done. While they understood the need for rest, the demands of the mission often superseded the need for physical preservation.
He was literally spending his health and strength for the cause.
A radical disconnection from the self that we struggle to comprehend today.
The journey to the forks of the Delaware was immense. From May 8th to 12th, he traveled about 100 miles across the woods through what he called a desolate and hideous country to Saskatchewan.
And his initial reaction there on the Lord's Day, May 13th, was one of profound, immediate despair, even greater than at Kaunaumeek.
The gloomy scene was immediate and total. He felt very poorly. The morning was gloomy, and crucially, there was no Sabbath observed. Children were playing games, and he was a stranger in the wilderness with no interpreter.
He'd left the one soul who spoke English, and now he was truly starting from scratch in a new, alien territory where the local Indians were completely unacculturated to Christian customs. The mission appeared dark and almost impossible.
Yet, despite this sinking soul, he records his crucial inner support. He never entertained any thought of quitting my business among the poor Indians, but was comforted to think that death would ere long set me free from these distresses.
It sounds bleak, but there's a strange comfort in that statement. He's not comforted by the potential success of the mission, but by the relief of death, which he views as the ultimate freedom.
He found encouragement only when he preached to the few Irish settlers there who were sober and concerned, and then to the scattered Indians who were attentive. That allowed his soul to rest on God and take courage.
And that rest, the ability to rest on God and take courage, that's the whole point of his diary. It proves that his inner spiritual state was the only true measure of stability. Even when the mission field looks desolate, the fact that he hasn't abandoned his calling means he's aligned with divine will, and that's a greater comfort than any visible success.
He begins his ministry there immediately. By May 20th, he's preaching twice to the Indians, working to remove their prejudices against Christianity. He also preaches to the Irish settlers, noting that, especially one who had been educated Roman Catholic, seemed concerned for his soul.
It shows the breadth of his ministry. He's reaching out to all who are present, not just his target population.
But the challenges of the culture remain stark. On May 27th, he attends a heathenish funeral, which makes him mourn, longing that they might be turned from darkness to light. But he perseveres, finding the Indians very attentive when he gathers them to preach.
And the end of the chapter brings him away from the desolate mission field briefly for a formal institutional closing of his year of trial.
Right. By June 11th, he arrives at Newark, New Jersey for his ordination. His body is weak, but his mind is entirely focused.
This is the formal sanction that confirms his previous year of self-imposed duty. It's the moment the church formally recognizes the calling that Brainerd had already been executing under his own terms.
The burden of his calling is immense, even now. He writes, "My mind was so pressed with the weight of the work incumbent upon me that I could not sleep this night, though very weary and in great need of rest."
He preaches his probation sermon and undergoes the final examination.
Finally, June 12th is the ordination, with the sermon preached by a Reverend Mr. Pemberton. Brainerd's final entry in this chapter records his solemn vow, the culmination of his year in the wilderness.
It's a powerful closing.
He says, "At this time I was affected with a sense of the important trust committed to me. It was composed and solemn without distraction, and I hope that then, as many times before, I gave myself up to God, to be for him and not for another."
He had completed a year of preparation that stripped him of worldly ambition, physical comfort, and any reliance on himself. He walked into that ordination service not as a hopeful young graduate, but as a seasoned soldier, tested by fire and isolation, who had already willingly rejected the world's comforts.
So his vow was just the official confirmation?
A confirmation of a commitment he had already fulfilled 100 times over in his private diary.
Wow. We have spent time in the mind of David Brainerd, witnessing a relentless inward struggle that far eclipsed his immense external suffering.
What stands out to me looking at Edward's meticulous record is the absolute nature of his piety. This wasn't a life of spiritual convenience. It was a radical, daily choice to align himself with God's will, even when that required confession, self-denial, and physical agony that we would deem, unsustainable today.
The central paradox of Brainerd's journey is his profound conviction that his best duties were contaminated by those corrupt mixtures of pride, yet the antidote wasn't withdrawal, but intensified action, laboring, and praying harder. He found profound spiritual rapture while existing in a state of extreme temporal deprivation. He felt as blessed as a king while surviving on boiled corn. He really taught us that true contentment isn't about the fulfillment of desire, but the complete resignation of providence.
And the modern world often demands instant results. It demands immediate validation, judging work by clear metrics, by output, by measurable success.
Of course.
Brainerd's year of lonely labor, marked by profound despair and frequent feelings of failure, resulted only in a few souls inquiring what they should do to be saved. His diary teaches us that the true value of difficult work isn't found in external achievement or numerical success, but in the internal transformation, the purification of the worker himself.
So his primary success was his own growth in conformity to God's will.
Which then, secondarily, made him fit for future service.
Think about that. Brainerd chose the path of excruciating labor and isolation, not for the results, but for the work itself, trusting that the ultimate reward was simply the continued ability to serve.
Exactly.
If this deep dive into David Brainerd's journey and the meticulous notes of Jonathan Edwards has illuminated a new perspective for you, don't let the conversation end here. To ensure you receive every future deep dive directly, please subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue to unpack these complex stories and texts.